Stephen Cook, thank you so much for joining us on TvAbraham.
My pleasure to be here.
And let's start out, we first met over 25 years ago.
In Egypt.
In Egypt. And you were
I was a grad student.
You were a grad student, but also a junior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, right?
No, I had just finished a stint at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And I was launched on my dissertation. And I came to Cairo and I had lots of questions. And they said I had to come talk to you.
Yes. And I took you and I think Steve Simon around. We did the rounds. So you've been coming back to the Middle East now for over 25 years on extended stints and going in depth on the key issues. This start off with a general question. How would you say your thinking about the Middle East has evolved over those 25 years?
Oh, I mean, it's evolved quite a bit, actually. Once I finished my dissertation, which looked at the durability of authoritarian regimes in the region, I dedicated a good number of years of my career to thinking about reform in the region and what the role of the United States might be in the region, and wrote quite a bit about how the United States might help promote democratic reform.
Right, you were in favor of all that.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. The first time I was ever in Foreign Affairs, which was a huge thrill, it was an article. It was like how best to promote reform in the Middle East. I wrote on that theme quite a bit, and then I think a watershed was the uprisings in the Arab world. I was in Cairo for the uprising against Muslim Mubarak.
The so-called Arab Spring.
The so-called Arab Spring. Notice I wrote a book on that called False Dawn, and I only used Arab Spring once in the entire.
You don't use it once.
No. Only used it once. I called it the Arab uprising because Spring suggested that these were revolutions, and I came to the conclusion that these weren't revolutions. In watching these events unfold, both at the time and then subsequently, and looking at the way, first the Bush administration pursued the freedom agenda, but then the Obama administration tried to do a freedom agenda kind of 2.0 after the Arab uprisings, it quickly became clear to me that the United States did not have the kind of role in change and reform in these societies that we in Washington told ourselves we did.
Right.
That it was really up to Egyptians themselves and Tunisians themselves and Libyans themselves and other places, that it was up to them, and that our role was not critical in these uprisings, and that we actually had very limited power to forge change, encourage change, whatnot. And that's been sort of the second part of my career, is the sort of revisionism of the first part of my career.
Right.
Looking back at what I learned in grad school, trying to apply it, looking back at what I learned through my first part of my career, and trying to understand actually what the best way forward is. So certainly the way in which I've looked at the region has evolved quite a bit. Much even earlier in my career, when I was quite young, in my 20s, I lived in Jerusalem for a period of time. Thought a lot about the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. Have very different views of it now than I did way back when.
Yes.
Well, I just don't.
How is that? How would you characterize that shift?
I think in the past, like many people thought, that there was a viable two-state solution to the conflict. I haven't thought that in a long time.
Okay.
Not since President Obama got involved in negotiations with John Kerry.
John Kerry.
I remember I wrote a piece. I had a blog at the time. It was called From the Potomac to the Euphrates. And I wrote a piece about, and it was, I think I snarkily called it "Blessed Are the Peacemakers."
Right.
But I opened it by saying that I didn't understand why they were doing it, because I didn't see that there was
no path.
There was no path. Exactly.
So you've been a bit skeptical now, but others, you're
because I'm older.
Right.
Notice the gray around the temples.
That's right. But I mean, and in your latest book called End of Ambition, you're where a lot of others are, I think, particularly within Washington, that not to overinvest in the region. I could say 3 words, not to overinvest.
I think that's right. Okay. I think that there's an investment to be made in the region. A lot of people who say don't overinvest, for them it's a kind of nice way of saying we really don't have interest in the region. We really should withdraw from the region. Maybe we should be, offshore balancers. I don't actually think
you're not there.
I'm not there. I think that we do have important interests in the Middle East. but I think that we lost the thread beginning in the mid-1990s, where the United States stood alone in the world, and we had a lot of power.
Yes.
And we decided we wanted to transform the world, and one of the places we really wanted to focus was the Middle East. And I think that's the wrong way to be in the Middle East.
But so let's look at one scenario. Let's test this by looking at one issue set. The obvious one is Iran.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if the U.S. has overinvested but managed to somehow contain Iran to some extent, and we'll see what happens next. But as we sit here, Iran is pushing back against attempts to do a negotiation.
Right.
What does this skepticism, maybe is fair, or desire not to overinvest translate into when you look at Iran policy? How does that general feeling manifest itself in that policy towards Iran?
I'm glad you asked the question, because it gives me an opportunity to talk about my book. And in my
Okay.
book, I wrestle with precisely this. And
Yes.
what I say is that the United States should contain and deter the Iranians. And
But that takes a lot of
right, and
effort, right?
right, but those are things that
Doesn't it take a lot of investment to do that?
Yes, but I'm for investing in the region
Okay.
to the extent that we will have a return on our investment.
okay.
So the example I always use is, I say to people, well, what's less expensive in terms of dollars spent?
Yes.
And you know this. You spend a lot of time in the region, both officially and unofficially.
Mm-hmm.
Ensuring the free flow of energy resources out of the Persian Gulf,
Right.
or promoting democratic change in Egypt, for example.
Right.
Clearly, ensuring the free flow of energy resources out of the Persian Gulf is more expensive in terms of dollars spent
Yes.
than a bunch of democracy and governance programs for Egypt.
Right.
But what's more feasible? What has a better chance of
Right.
actually succeeding?
Right.
The free flow of energy resources. So, to my mind, it's money well spent to deter and contain the Iranians. I recently published a piece that was kind of radically counterintuitive to basically the two camps, or the binary way in which Washington looks at the Iran problem. Folks are all in on either negotiations or
Right.
on a military strike.
Right.
My view is that's kind of, both are overinvested in Iran and don't get us where we want to be.
Okay.
What we want is, we want this terrible regime to collapse in on itself and let the Iranian people take matters into their own hands.
Right. But there's been no sign of that, right?
There has not. I mean, it could be 3 weeks or it could be 30 years, and that's a risk. There's no guarantees here. But my sense is that if President Trump concludes a nuclear deal, the TCPOA, for just to be creative about
What does that stand
the
for?
Trump Comprehensive
Oh, the
Plan of
Trump
Action.
comprehensive. Right. I love it. Okay.
Rather than the Joint Comprehensive Plan of
Right.
Action.
The
So
Trump-
if the president succeeds in his goal he's basically handing a lifeline to one of the world's worst regimes.
Right.
Military strike may also do the same thing, creates a rally around the flag effect, unless you actually are sure that you can take out the
Yes.
regime in Iran. And I don't think anybody, talk about being overinvested, I'm not sure anybody really wants to do that. But to my mind, both things carry with them an enormous risk of extending the life of the regime. And it's the regime that makes Iran's nuclear program so dangerous.
Yeah.
So yes, it's a risk. It could be 3 weeks or 30 years for the Iran. But I think deterrence and containment is actually a wiser course of action.
Yes. And that requires a big U.S. presence in the region to
Big enough.
Yeah.
Big enough.
Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, et cetera, et cetera.
Money well spent, I think.
Yes.
Unlike an invasion of Iraq, which was also required a lot of forces, although I
Right.
think deterrent and containment don't require as much,
Right.
but not money well spent.
Got it.
And you know the Iraq issue very well.
Yes, I was a quote unquote volunteer in the early days there. Yes. Let's talk a little bit about Washington.
Okay.
Since I loved your recent piece talking about President Trump's visit to the Gulf. And what I particularly liked about it, we talked about this right before, is that you had a throwaway aside, but it was funny, as you often do. And it was something like, to deter others from sending me hate mail.
Right.
So I want to dig into that. Does that really happen? I mean, let's just do a scenario based in Washington, not in the Middle East. But let's just say you suddenly were all in on Trump policy. would you stop being invited to nice events like the Aspen Institute? And I mean, would you be taken off the luxury invitation list in Washington? Is that what happens? Because the hint, it was a joke, but sometimes jokes hint at a reality. The reality is you are worried about getting, if you say something positive about Trump foreign policy.
I think, this is not the first time that I've said positive things about President Trump. During his first administration, I praised what he'd done on Turkey at one point.
Right.
And I got a lot of emails from people.
Really? Saying,
"Oh, are you positioning yourself for a position within the Trump administration?" I said, "No, I'm calling him like I see him."
Yeah.
In my book, I'm very, very critical of everybody.
Right.
Obama, Bush, Biden, Trump.
Yeah.
But I also say, and I give credit where credit is due among all of those people. One of the things I say about President Trump in that book is that in his own peculiar way, he asked a really good question of people like us,
right.
which is, why do we do what we do?
Right.
And the answer from the American foreign policy community was, because that's what we do. That's not a good answer.
That's not a very good answer.
And the president essentially was asking people to check our homework. And we hadn't been asked to check our homework for 25 years. So that then subsequently, if you said something nice about the president, people would assume that you were approaching the issue in bad faith. You were trying to curry favor. You were MAGA or what have you. I don't know.
And I would never assume that you are. I would assume that you're calling the shots as you see them.
Right. I think that there are a lot of people in Washington who always assume, there's this weird phenomenon in Washington where people start referring to themselves as Democratic foreign policy analysts, Republican foreign policy analysts. And I say, no, that's not the way it's supposed to work. You're supposed to be a foreign policy analyst.
Right.
Whether you're Democrat or Republican should be immaterial.
Right.
I think that's happened because there's so much polarization in Washington and people are so reactive one way or another. I happen to have been blessed and feel it's a privilege every day to work for an organization that's strictly nonpartisan, that is independent, because it is well resourced. I think, I'm not sure if I'd be off the invitation list to whatever I get invited to, which is really not that much. But I do think, when I wrote this piece, what was interesting about this one, praising President Trump's speech in Riyadh, and there were some weird things about it, which is what I pointed out in the piece. I got a lot more praise than I got hate mail, and even from people who are identifiable Democrats who said, "Hey, thank you. That was really good, rigorous analysis, and now I understand better what he was getting at."
So you had both.
I get both, but I get hate mail from
there's
a lot of different places.
Well, that's good. It means people are reading you. The former Deputy National Security Advisor under Obama, one of them, Ben Rhodes, had this great line. Of course, he stole it from 1950s B horror movies, right? The Blob, right? There was a movie called The Blob. Is there a foreign policy consensus? Is there the blob?
Yeah, you're going to trigger me by using the term blob, and
Why? Is that a real thing?
No, it's not a real thing, and I think that Rhodes was engaged in an effort to try to fend off legitimate criticism of the JCPOA by basically casting everybody who works in think tank land as being, captured by, Israeli interests, corporate interests, and so there's this groupthink. And I've been around in the foreign policy.
You don't think there's a group?
There's a lot of animals in this zoo. Okay. There's a lot of animals in the zoo, and we tend to fight it out. I mean, there are times I remember at the kind of the heydays of the conversation about Egypt post Mubarak in Washington.
Right.
You could feel the tension in the room among the Egypt analysts because we didn't really agree on a lot of stuff. Right. You could feel the tension in the room on a lot of different issues, and there's been an ongoing battle between the restrainers and the interventionists and the liberal internationalists and people like me who see the value of arguments on all of these sides to try to make a coherent case about why the United States should be in the Middle East. And I think that Rhodes actually did a lot of damage here because what he did was he created, because he sat at this prominent place and is very prominent, he was, as when I reviewed his book, Robin to Barack Obama's Batman. It's a very, very prominent place. And so now Blob is sort of tossed off constantly without people actually really thinking about it.
Other people talked about the Washington Consensus. I mean, he wasn't the first to coin let's call it his was slightly more pejorative.
Right.
The Washington Consensus is a more neutral.
I guess
there's no Washington Consensus in your view?
In a sense, I mean, to be fairer to Rhodes.
Yes.
You triggered me by using the term blob.
Okay.
Oh, and again, something else that I point out in the book is that there is, look, people by and large in the foreign policy community in Washington are liberal internationalists. They believe at one point or another in the positive use of American power around the world.
Right.
But I think that there has been a lot more reflection about America's role and what was appropriate and what's not appropriate than I think Rhodes was giving people credit for, or others talking about the Washington consensus. But the idea that we kind of, as a group, kind of single-mindedly think very similar things, I think is inaccurate.
Yeah, I don't think the facts bear it out, right?
No. Rhodes' entire time in Washington were 8 years in the White House. Right. That's a place that can breed a lot of groupthink. And in fact, it did on the signature issue of the JCPOA. Yeah. To a person who worked on that issue during the Obama administration, they will say to you, there was no better deal. There was no better deal. Right. I think President Trump is in the process of testing that proposition, but others have come up with ideas that might have been better or should have been included in the JCPOA. I'm one of those analysts. I didn't get spun up one way or the other about the JCPOA. Right. I thought that the hunch at the heart of the deal, that the Iranian regime would be different by the time those clauses sunset, was wrong. Was wrong. Yeah. They deny that there was a hunch, but if you read what Rhodes himself has written, what Phil Gordon has written and said,
or Bill Burns,
they all had this hunch that at the end of the 10, 12, 15 years, it would be a very different Iran.
I agree.
It's not the case.
Yeah. But just to follow up on a Washington consensus, not to use the Bill Rhodes term, you and Phil Gordon wrote very similar books about the Middle East.
I think mine was better. No, I'm kidding. I think that they're similar in the sense that we've become so much skeptical of the use of American power to try to make quote unquote good things happen. The central insight of The End of Ambition was that when the United States tried to prevent bad things from happening, we were generally successful. When we tried to use American power to make good things happen, democracy, remake societies, build a Palestinian state, we generally failed, and we failed spectacularly in doing that.
Yeah, although
I think Phil was more interested in regime change, and and I think it's sort of loaded. I think it was a good book, but I think that he coded some of his data. It's not about Phil.
No, I agree with you. I mean, I'm not sure that anyone thought that the U.S. could build a state for the Palestinians. They were trying to find a pathway to, that was never the goal. Right. But I hear you. I mean, there's the road is littered with failures. Let's talk about Egypt a little bit. Okay. At one point, where we first met, and we've both been intertwined with that wonderful country. What I find out about now teaching a course on it to undergraduates is that it's a lot more fun sometimes to remember and teach it and read about it from afar rather than actually live in Egypt, which can be a hard place, right?
It can be a very hard place.
It can be a hard place. But around the time of the Arab uprisings, you prophesized that this would be the end of the U.S.-Egypt strategic relationship. Has that come about? How would you say it now? Years later. I mean, to be fair, that was 15 years ago.
I talked about the long goodbye between the two countries. And
has that happened?
No. I think no, but I do think that the strategic relationship is much different from when, for example, you were like right up front with it. I think that the idea that we kind of share a range of big projects in the region no longer exists.
Is that because of Egypt's capacity, or is that something else in the relationship?
I think it's a combination of the fact that Egypt doesn't really have the same kind of capacity that it once did, if it ever did. I mean, there is this sense that Anwar Sadat told a story to Henry Kissinger, and Henry Kissinger bought it. Right. And it much to the benefit of both Sadat and Egypt over all these many years. But I think that the Egypt as the kind of primary partner and stability and security in the region is really no longer the case. I think that for many years, I don't want to be so crude as to suggest that the relationship is boiled down to the $1.3 billion of FMF, that the foreign military financing that the Egyptians get per year, and the fight that happens over it in Congress.
Right, right.
But that's basically where we are, and it seems there's a lot of sunk costs and bureaucratic machinery that's involved with this. But that to talk about what it is that the United States and Egypt kind of do together in the region isn't really there. The Egyptians probably, in their defense, are assigned the worst job in the region, which is to wrangle Hamas in Gaza.
Yeah, that's a hard one.
It's a hard job, and to deal, with the Israelis, who aren't so easy, as you also well know. But I think that the slowly over the course of at least the last decade, power has really shifted to the east, and Washington's primary partner in the region is really Saudi Arabia.
Sure.
It doesn't have some capacities, but it has others that are, I think, beneficial to the United States. And Egypt is turned inward, has lots of problems. And the FMF is a legacy of that strategic relationship where that distance has been happening for some time. Egyptians have long been interested in other external powers as sponsors of Egypt's development. China
is there.
In a big way.
Yeah.
So maybe if we define the long goodbye less in terms of a decade or 2 decades, maybe 3 decades, well, let's get back in a few years. We'll talk about it again.
Fair enough. Let's talk also about Turkey very quickly. We're doing
sure.
If you talk to Israelis, they're very worried when the long-term president of that country, Tayyip Erdogan, talks about marching troops to Jerusalem. They take it seriously. When I talk to people in Washington, they say, that's his rhetoric, but, he has no capacity to do that. He has no intention of doing that. What do you think?
I think that if I was Israeli, I would take it very seriously as well. And I don't think, and I have from time to time, particularly after the flotilla incident back in 2010.
Yes.
I had said, I think the United States needs to, put on the black and white stripes and be the ref between the Israelis and the Turks in the Eastern Mediterranean, because I thought that there was a real possibility that, mistakes would happen, there would come to blows. And I think that President Erdogan, who does not come from a Muslim Brotherhood tradition, Turkish Islamism is different, but he has nevertheless taken up the mantle of the Brotherhood. AKP, the Justice and Development Party, has long had a relationship with Hamas. They have terrible blind spots with regard to Hamas. They have allowed Hamas to run operations against the Israelis. That this is someone who, whether he means it or not, has created an epicenter of anti-Israel activism, and that's Istanbul and Ankara. And that this is very, very serious. And that now Turkey and Israel are cheek by jowl in Syria. Both have competing security interests there. You can argue about what those are and whether those are appropriate, but nevertheless, they believe them. I think there's some good news in that Erdogan, after talking tough, seemed to have backed off. I think the Turks were quite impressed with Israel's military proficiency in taking down Hezbollah and what they do. They unveiled weaponry that no one believed that they had or knew that they had when they went after the Iranians last October. Those kinds of things. And so, despite his rhetoric, I think that he had said, we don't want this full-scale conflict. And then, of course, the President of the United States, President Trump, laid down a marker with Prime Minister Netanyahu. Remember, in that Oval Office, he said, be reasonable, Bibi, be reasonable, Bibi.
Yes.
And we know Trump has a much better relationship with Erdogan than he does with Netanyahu. And then, of course,
he says so.
I think there's fair evidence that he likes Erdogan.
Although he's also threatened to crash the Turkish economy.
Exactly. That's when I wrote that piece saying the president did the right thing. Well, that's the thing, is that the president doesn't have a commitment to any of these people. He's thinking about what his goals are, whether they're personal or national. The other thing is, I think the other piece of good news on the Turkey-Israel front is that Azerbaijan has good relations with both countries and are seeking to develop some sort of mechanism. But if you're sitting in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem and you're looking at what the Turks have done, They have chosen not to be constructive. They could have used their relationship
Yes.
with Hamas to help after these, 600 days now?
Yeah.
And they chose to be destructive. And I
Yes.
think that is important. Too often in Washington, your former colleagues from the State Department and others want to excuse
Right.
bad Turkish behavior.
Yes.
And in fact, American goodwill only begets bad Turkish behavior.
Right. There is that.
I mean, it was
Turkey.
extraordinary. It was extraordinary.
How
The Israelis killed Yahya Sinwar,
Yes.
and the Turkish embassy in Washington flew its flag at half-staff.
Is that right? Wow.
Yeah. Yahya Sinwar, who's responsible for not just Israeli blood,
No, of course.
but American blood
Right.
as well.
And others. Yes.
Yeah.
No, the whole thing about Erdogan, it reminds me of the New Yorker cartoon of a guy, it's a Mayan cartoon where a guy's being pulled up the pyramid to be sacrificed. And the two priests are telling him, except for the actual sacrifice, it's largely rhetorical and symbolic. So, there's a lot of rhetoric and flags at half mast, but behind it, there may be problems.
I mean, look.
Let's hope not, right?
Let's hope not. Let's
Yeah.
hope not. But I think that if you're Israeli, you have to take it seriously. And if
Yeah.
you're in the United States, you should take it seriously too.
Yes.
And try to tell everybody to cut it out.
Right. And, the other thing is what Trump said is still the case, which is that Turkey has unique vulnerabilities that, for instance, Iran doesn't. Iran is not tied into the international economy.
Right.
It's,
Which is why the president was so effective when he threatened to crash the Turkish economy.
Turkey survives because of inflows of capital
Right.
and trade ties with Europe and elsewhere. And so it can be effectively.
Right.
And Putin has also threatened its economy when it doesn't like what Turkey is doing.
Right.
So
And effectively.
And
very
effectively.
effectively.
Yes.
Well, this is, I don't want an American president to behave like Putin, but when the Turks shot down a Russian fighter jet that had strayed into Turkish territory,
right.
Putin put the screws to Erdogan.
Yes, he did.
And the screws to the Turkish economy because there was a lot of trade.
And tourism.
And so on and so forth.
Exactly.
And
and it worked, right?
He was tough. Yeah. Erdogan had to go to Moscow, bend at the knee and say, I'm sorry.
Right. So maybe that's a hopeful note that Turkey can be managed in a way that...
if we just be tough on them rather than have the new U.S. ambassador to Turkey advocating to let the Turks out of F-35 jail.
Do you really think that's going to happen? I doubt it.
I think Congress will
put a kibosh on
it.
There's a lot of people in Congress
Right.
that have concerns there.
Yeah.
But, looking at a little bit more internally, are we looking at the end of, let's talk about two countries in internal politics. Are we looking, someday this will have to be the case, humans being fragile, but are we looking now towards the end of the Erdogan regime in Turkey? And, by the way, the Netanyahu governments, coalition governments in Israel. What do you think?
I think we've had glimpses of the post-Erdogan era, the most recent municipal elections where opposition candidates won mayoralties, didn't just gain votes, but actually won mayoralties that had been held by the AKP.
Right.
And these were younger...
So it wasn't just Istanbul and Ankara.
Right, exactly. And were younger people who have staying power, but Erdogan has tried to now take down
those people. Yeah.
And so far he's succeeding in doing it.
Right.
So he may end up, he once said that he would be there till he goes to the grave, even though the Turkish constitution says he is termed out.
Yeah, he's going to have to change the constitution again, isn't he?
And that's what...
He's done it before.
And he's done it before, and that's part of this gambit with coming to terms with the PKK in hopes that he can, one, do in the opposition that is a real threat to him, garner Kurdish votes on a new constitution or constitutional amendments that give him another term or two.
Wow.
Yeah. So, but there have been glimpses. I mean, I think that he still has a huge constituency, but I think he's
only once gotten more than 50% of the vote. I mean, he cobbles together coalitions.
Right, and it's because the opposition is so divided and fractious and dumb, to be quite honestly, that it's been a gift for Erdogan. But, there are younger people who've only known Erdogan, and they hate Erdogan.
Yeah.
He's like the hectoring uncle that no one wants around.
Yeah.
But he has expanded the middle class. He does have a core constituency. He has appropriated the nationalist right as well as the Islamists, which are really fused.
Right.
So he remains a formidable opponent. What he's maneuvering now is how to deal with getting another term or two in office.
That'll be interesting. And
Netanyahu?
Israel, yeah. I mean, the question I suppose there is who would Naftali Bennett, who other than him?
Right. Well, what I say to people in Washington is that there's another BDS. The other BDS is BB derangement syndrome.
Right.
Is that everything?
The original one is
boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And the other one that afflicts a lot of people in Washington is the BB derangement syndrome.
Right.
Is that all bad things in Israel are a result of Prime Minister Netanyahu's cynicism, dishonesty, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
I'm willing to believe that he is cynical. I'm willing to believe that he's dishonest. I'm willing to believe that he has a trust deficit with almost everybody. But there's also politics in Israel.
Yes.
And my sense is that if Netanyahu were to go away and there would be an election, probably you'd get another right of center coalition. One maybe more stable, maybe one not dependent upon Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, because you'd be able to pull in some others. But I don't think you're going to have, as I think the Biden administration fantasized, that if Benny Gantz were the guy, that you would have the kind of fundamental shift on Gaza, fundamental shift on the West Bank, fundamental shift on those like kind of core issues. I don't think people really understood enough about Israeli domestic politics, primarily because I think Biden believed he understood better than anybody else Israeli domestic politics.
Yes.
So Netanyahu could go. The stunning irony is that if he lasts through this government's full term,
yes,
it'll be the first government in a while that lasted a full term.
People think that, but in fact, for the 4-year terms, he's done it before.
Has he done it?
2012 to 2016.
Okay, so it's been about a decade.
Yeah, it's been a decade.
Been a decade. Yeah. But so I think that
he's already the longest serving.
Yeah. Oh no. Yeah. Longest serving.
But you're right.
I mean, both these guys, Erdogan and Netanyahu, have kind of surpassed the great men of either country.
Right.
Erdogan has served longer than Ataturk.
Oh, for sure.
And Netanyahu longer than Ben-Gurion.
Ataturk, died young in his
because
early
he drank
50s.
himself to death almost.
Yeah.
So I think you're probably likely to get a right, center right, whatever you want to call it, coalition in Israel if there were a new election. I just, I don't see Yair Golan, making that huge leap. I don't see Yair Lapid, who has sort of moved to the left, capturing enough, plus he'd need parties on the right.
Right. Yes, of course.
And I don't think Gantz is a very good politician. So, and I think Bennett is. But of course, the other thing that bothers me about Washington is that people look at the politics in Israel like they look at U.S. politics.
Right,
So
of course.
I don't know how many people tell me, oh, well, Netanyahu has 25% approval rating. I was like, that doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Depends on how many votes parties get.
Yeah.
So
right, it's a different system.
It's a totally different
You're
system.
absolutely right about that. Okay, one other final question, if I could, Steve. Looking back on your long experience, give us an anecdote here. Tell us a story of one of the most bizarre things that you encountered in your travels in the Middle East.
Oh my God, I
didn't give you a hint of this. So
no, there's been a few. Okay. Well, there's the lunch I had with what was unmistakably Hamas guys in Fahim within Israel, but that's not as much, not as crazy and bizarre as I was in Oman a number of years ago. Oman in Muscat.
Yeah.
And the Omanis, they're the mediators. Their doors are open. They have channels with everybody: Israelis, Iranians, everybody. Among the channels they have are the Houthis.
Yes, of course.
And
Houthis live there.
Yeah. And so I had an encounter with the Houthis spokespeople.
Oh my gosh.
This guy Mohammed Abdel Salam.
Yes.
And
he just showed up at a lunch.
Well, it was a dinner. It was in a private thing. There was a group of them. And I said, let me ask you a question. You guys fight under the banner of God is great, death to America, death to Israel, damn the Jews.
Right.
Victory for Islam. And they said, yeah. And I started asking this question because in my encounters with other extremists in the region, they often kind of downplay.
Did you ask them, how do you feel about Yankee fans?
I could have.
That's a subset
but
of...
often in these encounters with people, they sort of downplay. They look,
Yeah.
And I said, do you guys really believe those things? They doubled down. They said, oh, absolutely. This is our program. If our flag was bigger, we'd have death to Saudi Arabia as well. And these guys really believed that they were going to drive to Riyadh and raise this flag. And I was like, I'm in this dimension.
Yeah.
Here's this little Jewish kid from Long Island. And these guys are like, oh yeah, we absolutely believe it. It was extraordinary. I've had some also really wonderful experiences in my time in the region. It's not always an encounter, with extremists, and I have really dear and close friends around the region, and which has been so difficult because I have Israeli friends and Palestinian friends and Lebanese friends and Egyptian friends and Saudi friends and all these people who are wonderful and smart and caring and so on and so forth. That the last 19 months of just kind of unrelenting dehumanization of people has really had an impact on me. It's just,
You mean the war in Gaza?
Yeah, the war in Gaza.
Effects,
and its after effects, and that, I know all of these well-meaning people who want to live together and prosper and watch their children grow up. And just the endless dehumanization of everybody has been very, very difficult.
It's here in our own country.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, on that sober note, Steve, thank you.
Thank you.
This has been
a
a
lot
great
of fun.
conversation. Thank you
I'd
very
love
much.
to come back. Thanks.
Anytime. Thank you very much.
Thank you.